Thank you very much, Sir Andrew and Eric. Boy, after an introduction like that, it really set high expectations. But it's wonderful to be here in London at LBS with all of you tonight, and I really appreciate the turnout. I think we'll have an engaging conversation. But I must start with just a couple of brief stories. First of all, it's always a pleasure to be here in England. My wife and our son and I had a chance to live here several years ago. It always feels a bit like coming home. And so getting a chance to be in town and spending a few days, we always really enjoy. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. And secondly, it's only fitting that I was here, I guess, on Remembrance Day yesterday. And I want to really congratulate the great outpouring of support that I saw for soldiers, for all those who have served in the services here in this country. We were actually walking around yesterday and a small parade went by. And to see the 85-year-olds for the Salvation Army and other people walking, and people stop in the streets and pause a moment and reflect on what they had done, I think is a great statement about the UK and all of you here, so it was wonderful to see that. But look, at Johnson & Johnson, we really value our relationship. We're happy to be the sponsor and to be able to be here participating in this conversation today. You guys have had a great start to the year. We had a chance to watch the Olympics from the U.S., and I got to say, what a great show. And I think there were a lot of business metaphors there because, first of all, you absolutely got the logistics right. In spite of all the challenges, and good business performance always starts with great logistics. Secondly, I think the innovation and the pageantry, what marketing. So the opening and closing events were impressive. And finally, it came down to the athletes themselves, and they performed in a spectacular fashion. But what I'm really here to talk about tonight is obviously healthcare. And there's a lot of different takes and discussions and debates that we could have. But I guess the way that I would start off was just with a premise. And that is, while we certainly face a lot of challenges today around the world, whether they're economic, whether they're political, geopolitical, social issues, there's no shortage of big problems that we've got to get our hands around. But I guess my overall thesis for tonight is, I think healthcare and how we're going to provide access to healthcare with high quality at an affordable and sustainable manner is likely the greatest challenge of our generation. And for many of you sitting out there right now trying to think like I did not too many years ago, what am I going to do when I get out of business school? What big issue do I want to try to tackle? Where do I really want to make a difference? I hope that tonight maybe spurs a few thoughts, because there's few other areas, frankly, that impact such a large segment of economies around the world, that touch people in such an individual, personal way, and frankly, that give us such an enormous challenge as a society on how are we going to solve this. And I certainly don't want to stand up here tonight and say that I've got all the answers, because I don't. But at Johnson & Johnson, we've got a pretty good perspective, given the depth, the breadth of our business around the world in this broad, diverse, space of healthcare. And so I thought I'd do is share, maybe a few of my thoughts on that. But I've seen that I've already skipped over one important note in my notes here, and that is to congratulate the winners of the LBS J&J case competition. So I guess 35 teams from 5 schools competed, and one of the LBS teams came in a close second. So let's give them a big round of applause. So most of you probably think of Johnson & Johnson as a baby company, I bet. In fact, let's just sit back in the chair for a minute. When I say Johnson's baby powder or Johnson's baby shampoo, how many of you can actually smell it? Come on. Is that great branding or what? I mean, it's a visceral, personal feel, and it doesn't get much better than that. But what many of you may not know is just really how diverse of a company we are, really touching so many different spaces in healthcare, whether it's medical devices. We're the world's largest medical device company, pharmaceutical products. We're in the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. And of course, as a consumer company, that's what people know us for. So in those cases, we help you live longer, healthier, happier lives. And the other, we help you feel a lot better about yourself. And we think all those are wonderful areas where we get to compete and get to participate in every day. Now, some of you may also know Johnson & Johnson, being here at business school and doing a few case studies probably in your free time about our credo. And in fact, I should probably start by just doing a brief tribute to one of our former CEOs, James Burke, who just passed away a few weeks ago. And James was the CEO during the Tylenol crisis that we experienced, and was really known as somebody who really had just a tremendous commitment to this document. And unfortunately, he passed just a couple of weeks ago, but he's certainly somebody that we won't forget. But with our credo was written back in 1943 by General Robert Wood Johnson. And it's kind of interesting because at that time, it was a private company. So he was really the senior shareholder of the company. And in longhand script, what he wrote out was this document that talked about our responsibilities. And first and foremost, it was a responsibility to patients. It actually says to mothers, to fathers, to customers who use our products every day. The second paragraph talked about a commitment to our employees. Now, this was 1943. This was long before a lot of companies had those types of thoughts in their value statement. But he went on to talk about making sure you're providing a good work environment where people can be their best, where they can feel secure in their career. Third, he talked about our commitment to our communities and knowing that we're part of an ecosystem, and that do we have good relationships with our suppliers? Do we take care of people around our factories, around our workplaces that may not have as good of a life? And again, this was quite a few years ago, before it was cool to be green, and even a commitment to our environment in the surrounding areas. And then ultimately a commitment to our shareholders. But it was doing 1, 2, and 3, and then ultimately the shareholders should get their fair return. And it's an amazing document, but beyond being a document, what I can say at J&J, it is a way of being. And I'm very proud of the fact that having worked there for as many years as I can, I participated in a lot of discussions, and Sir Andrew and I were talking just before he came in here. There's been a number of times where you're dealing with a difficult business issue and you say, wait a minute, this is a credo issue, what should we do? Now let me say first off, we don't get it right all the time. And we certainly have had our stumbles along the way. But it makes me very proud to know that it's something that we truly use to help us make the right decisions each day in our business. And it's something very important to who we are as a company and who we are as individuals and employees within that company. Now, I mentioned earlier we're a very broad-based company, and new in my role, I'm finding more about that every day as I try to take it on. But we're about 130,000 people. We work in 250 different operating companies with a decentralized management philosophy spread across 65 nations and bringing products to about 175 countries. And the way that I describe that is if every one of those countries or companies has a good day every day of the year but one day, that means I get a pretty good challenge every day. And it's certainly the case in something as far-flung and complex as that is. And we're really driven by a purpose beyond our credo of helping people live longer, healthier, and happier lives. And I think if you talk to our scientists, it's something that motivates them to come to work every day to truly make a difference, as well as with all of our employees. And I realize that one person at a time may sound kind of simple when you think about the totality of healthcare, but we think that that's the way that we should try and think about it, is how does it affect that individual in addition to, quote, populations. So we're in areas such as prevention, diagnostics, medicines, devices, consumer health, and it gives us a pretty comprehensive view of healthcare around the world. Now, as a healthcare company and being in these spaces, innovations are lifeblood. It's so important to what we do, innovating day in and day out in everything that we did. In fact, last year, about 25% of our sales came from products that have been introduced in the last 5 years. You think about that. And when you start working the numbers, the tyranny of math, when you start working that backwards, the sheer volume that you have to get through and being innovative, being best. I'm sure some of my other colleagues also representing large organizations can attest to the fact that there's never a time when you can rest because it's so important for us to be innovating. Now, we've got a lot of research agreements with universities and countries around the world, and here in the UK and China. In fact, just recently, we announced the opening of a new innovation center led by Patrick Verheyen here in the UK, who's sitting up front, that hopefully is going to allow us to even tap better into scientists and innovation communities around the world. And we're also pleased that by doing things like that, we've been able to return a very good return to our shareholders. Over the last 50 years, for example, we've had consecutive dividend increases. Now, here in the UK, we've also been here for a while, since the 1920s. We've got about 6,000 employees in 13 different sites in Scotland and in Maidenhead in the south. And so we feel very good about our presence here. But what I thought, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to do is share my thoughts with you about this state of healthcare, and at this, what I believe is a bit of an inflection point. Some people will look back and say, well, we went through this back in the 60s, then we went through it back in the early 90s. But for a lot of different reasons, I think that we're at a different kind of inflection point now, where the pace of change is going to be faster, where we've got bigger challenges and bigger opportunities in front of us. But how do we reinvent ourselves? So when I talk about ourselves, it's not only Johnson & Johnson, but it's more broadly about healthcare. Well, I think it was Dickens who was here, who said, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And I think it's a good metaphor in some ways for what we face in healthcare. And so let me start by talking about some of the fundamental drivers of change. I think the first one has to do with globalization. And everybody around the world now is demanding more in terms of healthcare. Over the next decade, more than 1 billion people, think about that for a moment, there's about 7 billion, so about 1 billion people are going to join the middle class in places like China and Southeast Asia. In China alone, it'll go from about 200 million to 500 million. That's like another United States being put on to the middle class. And rising demand is good for patients and the healthcare industry, but it creates huge challenge for governments. And that gets to this issue that I mentioned earlier, how do we face this big challenge? Now you couple that, increasing middle class, with aging population. Every one of us in here is getting older by the minute, and that beats the alternative. But here too, you face the tyranny of numbers. Countries like Japan, Italy, Germany, more than 20% of the people are age 65 and older. And the UK is not far behind. I think it's about 19% here. In the US, somebody turns 65 about every 8 seconds. You know, the other statistic that I find quite impressive is that in the US now, there's about 70,000 people over the age of 100. What do you think that that's projected to be over the next 30 years? 1 million. Staggering. And when you couple that with the fact that people over the age of 65 consume about 7 times the amount of health care that you do pre-65, it becomes, quite daunting. Age-associated dementia now costs the world about 1% of GDP, and it's expected to rise by about 85%, with some of the sharpest increase in low to middle income countries. Now, another major driver of change is some of the disease that we're bringing on ourselves, like obesity, other global chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, in some cases cancer. Now, 60 years ago, some of the top challenges in healthcare were infectious disease, something like tuberculosis, for example. Today, chronic diseases like those that I just mentioned cause the majority of the deaths and medical costs in most countries. So over 50 million people die of chronic diseases every year, and rising rates mean that over the next 20 years, these illnesses are expected to cost the economies almost $50 trillion. And a large part of that just comes from decreases in productivity. So the next major factor that's driving it is consumerism. And what I love about the web is data information is ubiquitous. And the fact that you can get online, go in and have a very educated, informed discussion with a physician has really changed the fundamental dynamic in many places where you have access to that kind of technology from what it was even 20 years when you went in to see the doctor on something. Now it's not unusual to go in with your laundry list of questions and really be prepared to have a much different kind of dialogue. And certainly the media trend, our connected trend, our mobile trend is going to increase that only more. Now, the next thing that we're seeing in healthcare is a huge shift in our customer base. Now, Andrew mentioned earlier that I started as a sales representative. And many in our industry who have come in over the last 20 or 30 years, that's what you did. And you got in and you talked to doctors. And at that time, doctors were the primary decision makers, whether it was a choice in a pharmaceutical product, an antibiotic that was going to be used with you, whether you should have knee A or knee B if you were going to have your knee replaced. That's changed now, where today's new economic buyers, payers, hospital systems, they're looking not only at efficacy, but they're also looking at cost. They're looking at quality. They're looking at other factors. And finally, and certainly by no means least important, no discussion of healthcare is complete today without mentioning the very real-world economic constraints that we face. And governments are feeling that today. And it's really one of the key factors pushing against the demand. And so all these forces are going to push demand up that I talked about. But then, of course, governments and other payers are trying to come to grips with how are we going to pay for that? How are we going to do that in a sustainable way? And healthcare spending for the most part has outpaced GDP growth in many countries, and it's expected to keep rising. Today, healthcare consumes about 11% of GDP here in the UK, 10.8%. And between 9.5% and 12% in most of Europe, and almost 18% in the US. And on top of that, this recession that we're still experiencing has affected every country on the planet. You know, we've got austerity measures here in Europe. You're seeing some growth rates slow in the growth in brick markets. And clearly in the US, we've got our issues. We're facing the fiscal cliff that we'll all be dealing with in the coming months and years. And if you add all that up, it adds up to quite a daunting economic challenge. But what I would say is, while most countries are looking at this primarily from as a social cost, and clearly accountants can calculate the immediate budgetary hit and issues as it relates to productivity and economic progress, some fiscal constraints can disproportionately impact healthcare budgets. And as a result, we've seen as today, there's higher thresholds for reimbursement, greater demands for data, for information than ever before. In some cases, longer approval times to bring new technology to market with a lot more hurdles to get over. And clearly, it's our hope that governments are going to work alongside companies to find ways to balance the competing needs between innovation as well as our ability to pay for it. And I'm certainly going to talk more about that later. But when we add the economic impact of aging, chronic disease to already constrained economies around the world, it's easy to say how, of course, everyone's going to be saying we should be doing more with less. But I think it may actually get to the point where we're going to say, no, we probably need to do less with less. But how do we do that in a way that it doesn't have unintended consequences, and how do we manage such change? So what should we do going forward? Well, I don't have all the answers. But I have had a chance to get around the world and talk with a lot of people in healthcare, and I'll share with you a few of my insights. I think it starts with our first obligation to ensure that we have access for healthcare in a fair and equitable and in a meaningful way. Because we can bring all the great technology in the world to bear, and if people can't get access to it, it's not going to make any difference for them. You know, in the US today, there's about 48 million people, just 1 out of every 6 that went uninsured last year. And in a great many developing and even middle-income countries, investment in healthcare remains less than 5% of GDP, an amount that may be inadequate given some of the issues that I mentioned earlier. Public insurance can be limited and people pay out of their pocket for care, and sometimes it's unavailable. Now, I think it's important to note that there are many countries, some like China, that are working hard to expand access, especially in rural regions. I think over $125 billion they've made, or they're making in investments. And even in nations where universal access is given, sometimes covered investments may be limited, and valued options for patients just aren't available. So now, what I would say is that not only is providing access the right thing to do, but I think it's in the best self-interest of governments and societies. And the reason I say that is because I think improvements in healthcare can be key drivers of growth and progress. They're not just a social benefit. They can build worker productivity, reduce disability and poverty, and investments and enable education. This is good for society. This can lead to greater stability. You know, Harvard studies show that increasing life expectancy by just 1 year is linked to a 4% increase in GDP. So it really can get down to a productivity issue. Another study in China showed that reducing deaths from cardiovascular disease alone by just 1% a year for 30 years could generate economic value in excess of 10 trillion US dollars. So what this shows is that healthcare done right can be viewed as an economic investment. Now next, I think it's going to be critical that we continue to have a system that rewards and encourages innovation. We certainly haven't solved all the healthcare issues of the world. And some of those that I mentioned earlier, whether it's cardiovascular, metabolic disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, are really tough medical issues. And while some of the earlier diseases, we kind of had to find the receptor site and how to unlock it, now it's more like a Rubik's Cube. There are much more complex cascades, combinations, heterogeneous conditions that frankly are going to need a lot more innovation for us to be able to solve. And what we've got to make sure of, that cost-effective measurements, especially those that rely only on very narrow measures of efficacy or don't look over at a product's entire life cycle, that they can be misleading, and we have to read the data carefully. And when patients can't receive the medicine they need, that can lead to hospitalization, which of course drives even more costs in care. Now, government policy can affect innovation in a lot of different ways. There's fast-track programs that can accelerate in an appropriate manner regulatory reviews so that things can get to patients sooner. I think we've all got to work together to do that in a safe and effective way. Exclusivity tax incentives, again, done appropriately, can bring higher value to the healthcare system. And in the case of emerging markets, it's becoming increasingly important for us to try to harmonize some of the regulatory requirements so that we're not doing, you know, dozens and dozens of different reviews for one particular question. And that's something that we still have to work a lot harder on. So when we look at the societal must-dos of access and innovations, it's also clear that we need new thinking. And that's why I'm so glad to see so many of you here at LBS interested in healthcare, because it's going to take, you know, your work, your good thinking to solve some of these big dawning problems. We've got to find better ways of doing R&D, more efficient, more effective ways on how we deliver care. How do we actually prevent care in the first place? And how do we work together across so many different domains of the healthcare ecosystem to collaborate on behalf of patients? So while a lot of these challenges seem very formidable, and I think I said this earlier, I classify myself as a realistic optimist. I always like to see the glass half full, and I think it's going to take that kind of a mindset to help us address some of these issues going forward. And I think we can succeed, but it is going to take some new thinking. One of the reasons why I'm excited is that we're getting a far better understanding of disease, and we've seen a lot of great advances across so many different scientific disciplines. Genomics, bioengineering, regenerative medicine, nanotechnology, material science, to name a few. You know, one of the great things about my role is I get to walk into rooms of scientists every day and get to hear about some of the wonderful science that's being brought to life. Now, some of it's 1 year, some of it's 5 years, some of it's 10 years away, but it gives me a lot of hope that we can take on some of these things. And one of the things that we're spending a fair amount of time on at J&J is trying to bring these different disciplines together. So rather than looking at it as just pharmaceutical or devices, how do you combine the two to completely revolutionize the way that you might treat one particular condition? You know, we're working on a way to control bleeding intraoperatively, and if you're a surgeon, it's a very anxious time in your life if you can't control bleeding or you have a severe trauma case. And by bringing one of our devices, a static matrix, in combination with biologics, thrombin and fibrinogen extracted from blood, into a very unique new approach, we can bring bleeding under control in ways that were not realized before, within minutes. intraoperatively, or hopefully someday in trauma as well. So we're very excited about the opportunity that convergent sciences have of fundamentally changing the way we treat different conditions. Now, another area that we're very excited about, in fact, we were just talking about this before we came out here, is the area of personalized medicine. And well, we can hypothesize and speculate what personalized medicine is. What we mean by that is, how can we use diagnostics in combination with drugs to better identify the underlying causes of disease and which patients may respond to a particular treatment, or which patients may suffer a certain side effect from another treatment. We still have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of major technical challenges that we have to get over. But if we can go from trying to guess what affects 500,000 people to 50,000 people, or isolate people who will definitely respond, what a tremendous advance that would be. We're seeing some of that right now in J&J in our circulating tumor cell technology for breast cancer. So it counts, and characterizes tumor cells, providing very important biologic information to help give the right medicine for that particular patient. Now, beyond product advances, I also think we have a great opportunity today to mine data sets and to use big data to help select better therapies. And I think that's a real reason for optimism, and it's something that a lot of companies are spending a lot of time on. I'm also increasingly optimistic because of mobile connectivity, in the way that sensing devices, mobile applications can be electronic devices, miniaturized, can be used to help us better predict who, again, may respond, who may not respond, how we treat some of these chronic diseases. So what are some of the things that we're looking to going forward? How do we take advantage of these as we head into the next century? Well, first, I think it's going to take innovation. It's going to take products that really make a difference in patients' lives. I think incremental innovation is going to be more and more challenging, and that by definition means there may be more risk involved at times if you're not just dealing with incremental innovation. But that is certainly going to be critical for us going forward. Products that really make a difference, that save and extend lives in ways and where data can support it. We're very proud of the fact that we've been able to do that at J&J. In areas like HIV, we've done a lot of work. And you think about it, 15 years ago, if you were diagnosed HIV, it was almost a death sentence. Today, it's a chronic disease. And if we can get after some of these other conditions in the same way, there's so much that we can do. I also believe that in addition to being highly differentiated, products that can help not only help patients, but reduce hospital readmissions, shorten procedures for your length of stay, require less skilled workers at times, move the site of care from a hospital to a less intensive site of care, or things that have fewer side effects are also going to be rewarded. I also submit the products that have application in emerging markets that may be somewhat more simple, more straightforward, less complex, but can still deliver a high quality of care, sometimes just less features. Vaccines that don't need to be refrigerated, medicines that can be given once a month versus every day. There's a lot of lessons from the automobile industry, the computer industry, where I think we can have simpler, straightforward approaches that one day we will likely take back to developed markets and use them in those areas as well. Second, and I mentioned that I think we've really got to focus on how we do R&D. You know, when you think about the average cost of a pharmaceutical product being brought to market, it's unsustainable if we don't get after how we do some of the R&D. And we're looking for new ways to do collaboration and research. We know that doing research in the pharmaceutical industry today is not like it was 25 or 30 years ago, where you may have had a monopoly on a particular site with a small group of scientists. Because of technology, because of the ubiquity of information and data, it can go around the world, and your ability to tap into these different sites is more important than ever. And partner with scientists, academia, venture capitalists, companies, other venture startups is really more important than ever. And then being able to synthesize all that knowledge into information that really makes a difference. The other area that I think we need to work together on in a major way is healthcare delivery. In most cases, our systems are very, very disparate. They're not coordinated the way they should be. There's been some great pilots here in Europe that I think are paying off. For example, in the Valencia region of Spain, information and communication technology, ICT, is at the heart of improving the chronic disease patients, and it's much more integrated than others. They're using electronic health records, remote bio data telemonitoring, computerized clinical guidelines, and other tools to coordinate care. So we're really taking our Apple device and bringing it to bear on healthcare in new and unique ways. And I think there's tremendous hope for things like heart failure, hypertension, obstructive lung disease, and help better monitoring some of these patients. Now, there's many other examples in Stockholm and around the U.S. and in systems like Kaiser Permanente and Geisinger, where they're really just trying to do a much better job of integrating this care, much as we would a business or other areas. How can we bring some of that same thinking to healthcare? I think it's going to be critical. So as we think about going forward, I think another very important aspect, frankly, is how do we keep people from getting sick in the first place? How do we think about prevention? How do we think about wellness? And I got to say, this is a tough area because there's a gym on every corner. A lot of people have tried. There's a diet for every day. But we're looking hard at J&J at what can we do around wellness? And how can we get people earlier in their lives to take on certain patterns in the way they live that ultimately are going to help them live longer, healthier lives? How can we prevent disease vis-a-vis vaccines? Now, you think about it, the World Health Organization says that healthier diets and exercise and stop smoking alone can probably prevent about 80% of heart disease and stroke, 90% of obstructive lung disease, and 40% of cancer. And we've tried to do this at J&J with our own employees, and we've had good results. We find that when we personalize the information we said to them, we use the right combination of carrots and sticks and incentives for employees to get engaged in reward systems, that you can actually reduce the incidence of some of these conditions. And you have healthier employees. I'd like to think eventually we have healthier societies. We're trying some of these collaborations with some public-private partnerships in the United States. We've acquired Crucell in the vaccine space, but we know that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But I certainly believe health and wellness is going to be a critical component of trying to figure out what we do about in healthcare. So before I close, let me just wrap up with a couple of comments. I do believe we can meet this great challenge of healthcare in front of us. And I hope some of you see some of the optimism in spite of the daunting challenges that I just mentioned. For us to be able to provide sustainable healthcare in a world with so much need, but we do have to ensure we have got broad access, that we can deliver better care, that we can drive human progress to innovation, and that we can think our way through some of these tough issues. But I'm more convinced than ever, if we work together in the right way, we can do this. And partnerships in particular are going to be important because these are very difficult issues. Partnerships around R&D, around delivery systems, in all areas of healthcare are going to be absolutely critical, and even the way that we educate the public about some of the issues that we talked about. So thanks for allowing me to share these views. We're certainly entering a critical time. Human progress relies on a lot of things: strong governments, economies, but also great healthcare systems. And I'm hopeful that public payers are going to recognize the tremendous value health improvements bring, not just to people as individuals, but to societies at large, and to help us keep the great societal and economic progress going. And we realize that it's going to take a lot of reinventing of this great system to keep it sustainable. So with that, let me just say thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.